Welcome to Virginia Currents. I'm Daphne Maxwell Reed. Dr. Charles Sydnor has held many titles, including the President of Commonwealth Public Broadcasting Corporation, Executive Assistant to Governor Charles Robb, Director of the Virginia Holocaust Museum, and an expert witness for the US Department of Justice Office of Special Investigations, or OSI. Called the most successful Nazi hunting organization, the OSI has denaturalized, deported, or extradited over 100 accused World War II criminals from the United States. They relied on the research of historians like Dr. Sydnor. He donated hundreds of his trial documents to the Virginia Holocaust Museum, where he describes what drove him to expose over 50 Nazis involved in the worst atrocities in world history. A warning, some of the photos in this story are graphic.
A number of perpetrators, these are SS guards from concentration camps, managed illegally to gain entry into the United States by posing as victims, as political refugees, as economic refugees after the Second World War. These will be documents and exhibits from about 1981 until 2006. I served as an expert witness to the Office of Special Investigations and testified in civil trials that were brought by the Justice Department against former SS guards who had served in concentration camps. They were civil rather than criminal trials because we did not have jurisdiction over criminal acts in Europe. By our immigration statutes, those who had participated in the crimes of the Nazi regime or who had engaged in the persecution of other human beings were automatically excludable. They were not admissible to come to the United States. These are documents that we had captured after the war and then given back to the Germans in the 1960s. Based on over 20 years of research, I knew what had been done, and I understood how the camps worked, and I understood how the SS was involved in the persecution, and exactly what the SS did, the guards did. We had not only photographs, but there were we had eyewitness statements, testimonies, oral histories, and stuff like that that indicated that they were awful. I mean, and in the camps, in some of the camps, of course, medical experiments were carried out on prisoners before they were murdered. That was how little regard they had for human life and how far they were willing to go to impose excruciating suffering on people before killing them. And knowing that, you know, it left no room for doubt with me. No, ever. You see these photos, these terrible photographs that the Germans took. I mean, they were proud of what they were doing. You can go through this museum and see just examples of the hundreds of thousands of photographs that German soldiers and SS men in the Einsatzkommandos took. They were proud of mass murder. I mean, they considered it hard work. There were all kinds of people saying, you know, why don't you leave these old men alone, let them die in peace? You know, what are you gaining now? And in the case of Haida in Chicago, the judge in that case, Judge Core, wrote an opinion that was almost poetic. You know, how it looked when the government of the United States, a continent and an ocean and 2 generations away from a European conflict, flexed its muscles, you know, to try to invest something in justice by depriving this man of his American citizenship, which he was not entitled to in the first place. A small token of justice, really. This is a recommendation for the promotion of Carl Streibel. He was the commandant of the Trebniki training camp, where all of the auxiliaries were trained for guard service in the extermination camps. Demjanjuk was trained at Trebniki. Reimer was trained there. Well, this is the most famous or the longest running saga in all this. John Demjanjuk, who was discovered in the 70s. The Justice Department obtained some documents that the Soviets provided, including an ID card from the war that indicated that Mr. Demjanjuk had served as a guard. And at the time, there were still a number of living witnesses, prisoners, who had been at Treblinka, and a number of them identified Mr. Demjanjuk in a photo spread and said that he was Ivan the Terrible, the Ukrainian who had run the gas chambers at Treblinka. So he was denaturalized. Then the Israelis requested his extradition to Israel, and he was extradited to stand trial for crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity. He was convicted in an Israeli court in Jerusalem, and sentenced to death. But before he could be executed, new documentation came to light from the Soviet Union, from the KGB archives, indicated that Mr. Demjanjuk was not, in fact, the man who had been at Treblinka. He had been at Sobibor. Mr. Demjanjuk was put on trial again. I testified in that case in Cleveland in the summer of 2001. And Judge Mataya found for the government and ordered Mr. Demjanjuk denaturalized again till the Germans requested his extradition to Germany to stand trial for murder while he had been a guard at Sobibor, the murder of several thousand German Jews who had been deported there. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. His lawyer appealed immediately, and within months of the appeal, Mr. Demjanjuk died. He was about 90 or 91, I think, when he died. There were times when I would get really almost frantic because of the intellectual strain. Because the only way the defense attorney had a chance of getting his client off was if he could poke a hole in my testimony, discredit me, catch me or trip me up in contradictions, prove that I had been factually erroneous in saying something like that. That was the only hope they had. So you had to be very careful. You had to listen to the questions very carefully. As an expert witness, I was never permitted to ask the defendant a question, of course. In fact, I was usually kicked out of the courtroom after I finished testifying, so I couldn't influence anybody else's testimony. But I wanted to ask Jacob Reimer if he had ever thought about how many people he'd been involved in killing. In all these pit shootings that you were involved in, how many people did you kill? Did you keep count? How many were women? How many children were there? Were there old people? I really wanted to ask those questions that no one would ever ask him and that he would never have to answer for. But I never, ever doubted the justice or the reason or the moral urgency of what the Justice Department was doing, ever. It was the ability to associate with the survivors. And when a survivor tells you that your testimony is so close to the truth that they can believe it, then you've hit the nail on the head. This is a country that led the world in medical research, in the development of pharmaceuticals, the invention of the X-ray, as well as toothpaste and other modern things. Germany was the world's leader in so many fields of education and the arts and culture in the early 20th century, that to have it turn around and become as ruthlessly and unmitigatedly barbaric as it was, puts out there an example that I think is pretty scary. So if you remember what they were able to do, maybe you'll be prepared the next time somebody tries to do this again. Because if somebody tries to do it again and you don't remember, they'll get away with it. They'll absolutely get away with it.
The Virginia Holocaust Museum is a destination that represents a history we shouldn't forget. For more, visit vaholocaust.org.